There is a vegan activist to alt-right pipeline, to white supremacy pipeline. It is very strong. Alt-right pipelines are all about coercion, control, limiting. It's all about judgment. It's all about purity. And very, very much so, the vegan to alt-right pipeline is really ramped up in this country. Trying to superimpose your own ideology. If you can't see that that's fucking white supremacy, spend a little time unpacking that.
Is there a vegan to alt-right pipeline, and is it a problem? My past videos have explored the ex-vegan to alt-right pipeline and the intersections between fascism and anti-vegan rhetoric. So, a few people sent me this video by Park Rose Permaculture, which asserts that veganism has an alt-right pipeline problem, and I will die on this hill. If you're new here, hello, my name is Natalie, and I'm an animal rights activist, which, according to Angela, means that I am a eco-fascist white supremacist. I just want to start by making it very clear that I am 100% against white supremacy, and I am also very concerned about the rise of the far right in the United States. That's why I often talk about how the far right weaponizes meat, masculinity, and anti-woke rhetoric. In this video, I'm going to respond to Angela's claims about vegan activism, white supremacy, and ethical omnivory. I'm going to show how she leans on racist tropes like the ecological Indian, how she uses progressive language to justify violence toward animals, and I'm going to analyze whether there actually is a vegan to alt-right pipeline. Although I disagree with Angela on almost all of this, there are times where she brings up valid critiques of the animal rights movement, so we'll go over that at the end of the video.
When I made a video about this humpback whale that recently died on the Central Oregon coast, and the way that whale enthusiasts, cetacean stan Twitter was just being like so overtly, horrifically racist towards the Siletz people, toward Indigenous people in general, and how this was not atypical for whale enthusiast discourse to go, that it's all very, very strongly steeped in an anti-Indigenous bias. And then I made a follow-up video on the macaw people and their attempts to get their rights restored to be able to hunt gray whales, and how hard people have fought against that, and how all of that kind of like animal rights activism very much overlaps with vegan activism. And when we look at this kind of like whale stand sphere, especially folks who are fighting against Indigenous people having their whaling rights restored, or in the case of the story I was talking about, Indigenous people being able to take the baleen and blubber and bones from a whale that had to be euthanized. And we're looking at those folks, and then we're also looking at the vegan activists who are trying to tell Indigenous people that their cultural food choices, their traditional foods are unacceptable, immoral. That is a white supremacist pipeline. That's white supremacy on full display.
This conversation about whaling, fur, anytime Indigenous people use animals for cultural practices, it's a tough conversation that requires nuance and respect. I want to kick it off by understanding why it's so radioactive in the first place. And to do this, we need to understand how marginalized groups have been animalized by white supremacy. For this part of the discussion, I'm leaning on Black vegan activists like Breeze Harper, Silco, AFCO, and others. Right now, I'm shooting this video in Louisiana, so I do want to share a little bit of Louisiana history with you. In the 1800s, there was a doctor here named Samuel Cartwright, and he was a real piece of shit. He basically created a medical career out of making up diseases that only affected slaves and then curing those diseases. For example, if a slave ran away, they weren't someone who was willing to risk everything for their freedom, they were afflicted with drapetomania. Cartwright also popularized a fairy tale about the land of Nod. This story claimed that Black people were created as natural slaves, that they rode on Noah's Ark alongside the animals, and that God had condemned them as natural servants to white people. Although that particular story was new in the 1800s, it was based on the idea of polygenesis, which was popularized when Columbus first laid his eyes on Native Americans in 1492. Monogenesis says that all humans came from the creation of Adam and Eve, but polygenesis said there were multiple creations and each racial group was created separately as their own species. This belief system allowed the colonizers to justify their horrific treatment of Africans and Native Americans by saying, hey, they're just animals, they need white people, otherwise they won't be civil. But hey, now it's 2025 and everyone knows that all humans are human regardless of race, and we don't have to worry about this anymore, right?
The 22-year-old nursing student in Georgia who was barbarically murdered by an illegal alien animal. The Democrats say, please don't call them animals, they're humans. I said, no, they're not humans, they're animals. Nancy Pelosi told me that. She said, please don't use the word animal, sir, when you're talking about these people. I said, I'll use the word animal because that's what they are.
In 2024, a Kansas City police officer pushed a black woman to the ground and called her an animal. A federal investigation into the Louisville, Kentucky police in 2023 found officers calling black people monkeys. These are not isolated incidents. They happen all the time. So sometimes when a marginalized person hears animals deserve rights, their nervous system translates that to, you're putting me on the same level of animals, and that means that you want to hurt me. White supremacy has weaponized animality against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. That trauma response is understandable and it needs respect. But we have to separate these two claims. One, marginalized people have been dehumanized by calling them animals. True. Two is that, therefore, it is wrong to advocate for animals. False. White supremacy asserted that the only way to be fully human was to be a white man. So justice has looked like expanding that definition to include women and people of color. But by accepting that human-animal divide and putting humans above animals, we're still accepting an unjust hierarchy that treats sentient individuals as disposable objects. This is called speciesism, or human supremacy. Animal is a category that we shove certain bodies into when we want to justify violence against them. The human-animal divide is the ideological bedrock underlying the framework of white supremacy. The negative notion of the animal is the anchor of this system.
The desire from both these whale folks and also vegan activists to erase entire cultures, because you come in with your colonizer mindset telling Indigenous people your traditional foodways are ones that I find immoral. I find them to be wrong. And I'm going to tell you, you don't have a right to eat your traditional foods, even though you have, from time immemorial, a connection to your food that is on a level that we colonizers couldn't possibly understand, even though you are some of the strongest activists for conservation of marine mammals. Even though you understand far better than we do how to eat sustainably, to respect the food that you are consuming, to have a tremendous amount of honor and compassion and respect for the animals that you are consuming, we're going to come in and tell you you're wrong and bad and immoral, and you need to move beyond your traditional foods and you need to eat how we tell you.
Okay, let's talk about cultural genocide. You probably know the basics about how Indigenous people have had their cultures erased by white supremacy, like with forced assimilation schools and removal from their land. So I think Angela's arguing that whenever a white person tells an Indigenous person that their culture is unacceptable, that is racist due to the realities of our history. So she's saying that even if the white person isn't intending to be racist, they can't separate themselves from the systems of exploitation that made cultural erasure possible, so it is racist. I'm going to argue against that view in a bit, but first let's discuss how white vegans can make these accusations of racism worse by coming across as insensitive, and that happens for a few reasons. The first is that the vegan may not understand this cultural context and how it colors their discussions. The second is that when you go vegan, you typically are rejecting your own culture. I grew up in Tennessee. Like most places, there's a strong culture of eating meat. And as a white vegan, when you see the ways that your culture is justifying violence toward animals, it makes you question other aspects of that culture and other cultures, and going vegan can give you a sense of disrespect for culture in general. At least it did for me. If that's you, that is a privileged belief. Because your culture hasn't been stolen from you, you've willingly given it up. White vegans often don't recognize that privilege and how it's operating in their discussions about this. Note, I'm not saying that veganism is privileged. I'm saying that specific rejection of culture is privileged. We know that vegan diets are actually about 30% cheaper than omnivore diets on average, at least in the US. But the way Angela is blaming vegans for cultural genocide is really unfair, because that's caused by colonization and white supremacy. At its heart, racism is about systems of power. vegans do not have any power in society. We don't even have food on airplanes. By blaming vegans for cultural erasure, you're taking the focus away from the systems that actually hold white supremacy in place. And where are these vegans that are constantly going after Indigenous people? The definition of veganism is to avoid animal exploitation as far as practicable and possible. We know that not everyone, especially say Indigenous people who have zero access to non-animal foods, can stop using animals. Most vegans agree that you can morally justify animal use if it's for survival. But the main point I want to make here is that 99% of the time when Indigenous people come up in discussions about veganism, there isn't even an Indigenous person present. It's almost always a white progressive who's using Indigenous culture as a shield to justify their own animal consumption. And that is not okay. In Nice Racism by Robin DiAngelo, which is about how white progressives cause the most daily damage to BIPOC folks, DiAngelo argues that white progressives have a particular fascination with Indigenous culture and often fall for the ecological Indian trope, which characterizes all Indigenous people as stewards of the environment or one with nature. But I won't talk about the ecological Indian trope too much here because Atunche Films made a 2-hour video about it, so you can watch that if you want to learn more. Personally, I think if a white vegan excused animal use from Indigenous folks who did have the ability to be vegan because the white vegan was afraid of being seen as racist, to me, that would be really disingenuous, and it would be holding different races to different moral standards, which is also bad. And the last point I'll make here is that while the term vegan was coined by a white man, the idea of not harming animals has deep roots in non-white traditions like Buddhism, Jainism, Ital, and others. So equating veganism with white supremacy is erasing them as well. Okay, now let's talk about the problematic ways Angela speaks about animals, and to understand this, we need to dive into vegan feminist theory with Carol Adams. In The Sexual Politics of Meat, Carol introduces the concept of the absent referent, and I'll admit it took my B12 deficient brain quite a while to wrap my mind around this concept, so I'm hoping I can explain it okay here. The absent referent is how animals are made absent in the entire process and act of eating meat. There are 3 main ways this happens. The first is literally, so literally the animal is dead. Meat only exists because the living, breathing animal is gone. They've been turned into steak, burgers, or blubber. You can't have meat without violence toward the animal. The second way is through language. The animal becomes definitionally absent. Instead of calling a piece of meat cow or pig, we call it beef, steak, pork, or bacon. This pushes the animal even further away, out of our language entirely. So we have literal absence, definitional absence, and the third way is metaphorical absence, and this is where sexual politics comes in. Adams explains how we use the fate of animals as metaphors for human experiences. Often experiences of suffering, objectification, or degradation. Like when women say, "He looked at me like a piece of meat" after a bad Tinder date. But notice how Angela reduces the whale down to food, tradition, and culture. This erases the violence toward animals to the point where it's so invisible that it's considered respectful.
Whenever I talk about ethical omnivory, I get vegans in my comments who fail to understand that we don't actually really give a shit about your dietary preferences. The fact that you think other people have not carefully thought through the way that they are eating, and that maybe they know better than you what they're going to put into their bodies and why. Maybe they know better than you their culturally appropriate foods. Maybe they know better than you what constitutes ethical eating for them.
Meat eaters often frame veganism as a dietary preference because that makes it really easy to dismiss. It would be ridiculous to care so much about someone's dietary preference. But by doing this, they're willfully ignoring the point we're making, which is that animals shouldn't be considered food at all. We don't oppose animal products because they're unclean or unpure. We oppose them because they come from animal exploitation and we think that that is wrong. For example, if somebody were eating a vegan burger, we would have no problem with that. We don't decry burgers as being immoral. However, when that burger comes from a cow who was separated from their family and killed at a fraction of their natural lifespan, yes, we do have a problem with that. Now let's talk about whaling and the small-scale animal farming that Angela promotes to see if it can really be sustainable or ethical.
As a permaculturist, my 3 ethics are earth care, people care, and fair share. And the meat industry in the United States violates all 3 of those. That is why we do not buy feedlot meat. We don't buy what my kids call unhappy meat, because we're not willing to support that industry that is cruel to animals, cruel and exploitive to workers, and entirely unsustainable, ecologically irresponsible, and funnels massive profits into these huge corporations and right into the pockets of CEOs and billionaires. It's totally unsustainable and totally unethical. But you can treat animals with respect and still be an omnivore. In fact, that is entirely why we are omnivores, but why we are very conscious in the quantity of meat that we eat and where it is sourced. And I would never presume to tell somebody else what foods are appropriate for them culturally and what foods are appropriate for them in terms of their diet. Love it for you if you're vegan. Awesome. I fully support your choice to eat whatever you feel is ethical and appropriate. Our family will continue to be omnivores.
Angela often brings up the vegan ideology, but she ignores that meat eating, or carnism, is also an ideology. It's just the dominant one in our society, so people don't think of it that way. But believing that humans can use animals however we see fit is also an ideology, and vegans are fighting against that. Angela describes herself as a scrunchy mom, or a crunchy mom who believes in science. So let's go over the scientific evidence on animal farming to see if it can ever be sustainable. We have the largest study ever done on this subject from 2019, which looked at 38,000 farms in 119 different countries and concluded that avoiding meat and dairy is the single best way to reduce your impact on Earth. Another one came out in 2023 that showed stark differences between vegan and omnivore diets in terms of GHG emissions, water use, land use, biodiversity loss, and more. Of course, when I bring these studies up, people push back that local farms are better, they're more sustainable. This is not true. Transportation is a small fraction of emissions from animal farming. The problem is the cow, not the how. In fact, when we compare grass-fed beef to industrial beef, the emissions are actually worse because the animals eat more fiber, which means they burn more methane, they take longer to reach slaughter weight, which means more methane, and they use more land, which harms biodiversity.
In permaculture, we're designing following the way that nature works. So our agricultural systems inherently must include plants, fungi, and animals because nature includes flora and fauna.
Angela talks about regenerative grazing, but there is no scientific evidence that says that grazing animals is better for the climate. In the best case scenario, it can offset 60% of emissions that the animals produce, and I'm working on a larger video about regenerative grazing, so I don't want to talk too much about it right now, but I will tackle the idea that regenerative grazing mimics nature. Animal farming does not resemble nature at all, especially when we're talking about cows in North America. They are not native to the land, neither are sheep or pigs or chickens. Yes, we had large ruminants like bison, but they behave completely differently from cows. And even if cows were native, it's not natural to kill them when they're less than 2 years old. Animals emit more methane when they're growing, when they're young. So, continuing to breed them and kill them when they're young is not sustainable. Additionally, there is no way to meet demand for animal products with small farms. We just don't have enough land. And while 99% of animal products sold in the US come from factory farms, 75% of consumers believe that they're buying from these small ethical farms. The existence and promotion of small farms allows people to believe that their meat is ethical, that the animals they exploited were happy. They use the idea of happy farms to feel better about consuming products that come from violence toward animals. That's why vegans push back against all animal farming. They all normalize the idea that humans are so superior we can just treat animals as objects.
So I haven't really interacted with that many self-righteous vegans lately. And I do want to say, our family was mostly vegetarian for a very, very long time until we started buying half a cow. And sometimes we buy half a pig or half a lamb from local farmers, where I know how those animals were raised. I know the conditions under which they lived. I know how his cows are raised and how they're treated. And we buy half a cow for 6 people. Half of a cow feeds 6 people for a year. And those animals are raised with respect.
Angela insists that her local farmer kills the animals humanely and respectfully. And maybe it is a really nice farm, but killing will always be an act of violence. Dressing it up in nice language doesn't change that fact. In any other situation, we would not delude ourselves into believing that killing someone who doesn't want to die is respectful. If I shot my healthy dog today, would that be respectful? Obviously not. So why is it so different when it comes to farmed animals? It's not.
The cultivation of plant foods results in the deaths of far more animals than, harvesting a cow. 6 people in my family eat half a cow for a year and 1 lamb or half a hog. So 2 animals die for a family of 6? Do you know how many animals die to produce grains and vegetables? Do you have any insight into that?
The idea that eating 1 cow kills fewer animals than eating crops is wrong for a few reasons. First is basic biology. Anytime you move up the food chain, 90% of that energy is lost. Cows, pigs, and sheep are often fed grains or even alfalfa grown in other areas if they're just grass-fed. That's all land that could be home to wild animals or used for crops specifically grown for human consumption, which would yield more calories. We actually reduce the amount of plants we eat by eating plants directly instead of filtering them through animals. Second, her family is not only eating that cow, they're also eating plants. Otherwise, there wouldn't be enough calories. If 6 people ate only half a cow, they would go through that in 20 days, assuming a 2,000 calorie per day diet. The math just isn't mathing. And no, we don't know how many animals are killed in the field for vegetables. But we should also factor in the wolves, prairie dogs, and other animals that are killed for farmers to protect their pasture. It's important to remember that vegans are against animal exploitation. And animals killed in crop fields are not exploited. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are also veganic farming practices which aim to avoid killing any animals, including bugs. We would love to live in a world where that's standard practice, but that is not the world that we live in right now, and we have to eat something. I do think more vegans should be aware of the harmful products they could be buying and try to do better. I actually made a whole video where I tried to follow the most ethical diet for 3 days, but my biggest takeaway from that video was just that it's really hard to find information. For example, I bought strawberries from the farmer's market here because they were grown in Louisiana. Later, I found out that most strawberries from Louisiana actually use prison labor to function. And obviously I don't want to support prison labor, so now I'm not going to buy strawberries, but it didn't say prison labor on the packaging. You just don't know. But animal products, you do know. You do know for a fact that an animal was exploited to get that product to you.
We want to see whales as being separate from nature. We want to see chimpanzees as being whatever it is that is your special animal that you have your special adoration for. Horses, whatever it is. We see it time and time again. This these animals are special. We're going to give them elevated status with humans. All of that is reinforcing a white settler colonialist Eurocentric mindset that human beings are separate from nature, above nature, that manifest destiny is a real thing, that we are, the Christian perspective that we're given dominion over creation, rather than the reality that we are part of creation. We are part of nature. We are not separate. We're not elevated above her. We exist within her. And falsely believing that we are separated has created this rift, has created this division that is harmful for us and harmful for nature. It makes it so it's far easier for us as white people to exploit nature if we believe we're separate from her. Then we don't think that when we harm her, we harm ourselves, but we do.
This idea that vegans separate themselves from nature is silly for a few reasons. The biggest is just that it seems to be the only behavior that people choose if they want to emulate wild animals, and they just ignore the animals' other problematic behaviors. Yes, animals eat each other. They also each other, they eat their babies. Refusing to eat your baby is not separating yourself from nature, and neither is refusing to eat animals. Also, just the irony that people always bring this up when they're living indoors and using cell phones. Like, why is not eating animals the one thing that makes you disconnected from nature, but everything else is fine?
We are part of the food chain. Whales are part of the food chain. Indigenous people remind us of that fact. They have a right to sustainably harvest those whales. They are greater caretakers, conservationists of whales and the environment in which whales live, because they know that they are connected to the whale. They know that they are connected to nature, that how they behave impacts not only the natural world, but them, because they understand that they are part of the natural world. This is a truth that we have forgotten, and we need to reconnect ourselves to. As uncomfortable as it is to have that truth restored in our minds and our consciousness, we need to allow it to happen.
But what about whaling? Does killing a few whales like the macaw want to, does that really affect the environment? Turns out whales can store a huge amount of carbon in their bodies. When whales are killed, that carbon goes up into the atmosphere and warms the planet. Even in the case of a tribe eating a whale after the whale dies, which Angela was talking about, it hurts the climate, because left alone, the whale's body would sink to the bottom of the ocean floor and sequester carbon for hundreds of years. Isn't sequestering carbon like the entire point of regenerative agriculture? And when it comes to the violence that animals experience, whaling is really bad. They're typically killed with harpoons, which often miss the target and cause whales to die slow, painful deaths, or to be harpooned again. Even if you think that there's a humane way to kill animals, I think we could agree that harpoons, which have grenades in them sometimes, are not humane. I do want to make it clear, again, that I don't think vegan activists should specifically focus on whaling done by Indigenous people. We should continue to focus on factory farms, commercial fishing, and unpopular animal products like fur and foie gras. Now let's talk about the idea that veganism is an all-right pipeline, and honestly, the example that Angela uses to make this point is so funny to me.
I want to address this comment that I got a ton yesterday that was like, there are not any vegans on the right. Veganism is a purview of the far left. And that's that's simply not true. When people bring up this talking point, sorry, I'm pulling up the story here. When people bring up this talking point, the first person I point to is J.P. Sears. Do you remember him? Way back in the day, he was like a, funny ginger dude who did yoga and talked about emotional wellness. He was a pretty prominent wellness influencer who seemed fairly innocuous, right? He was really big on doing comedy sketches to reach people about his wellness beliefs, about veganism, about yoga, about clean eating, right eating. And as more and more time went on, JP Sears just completely outed himself as like full on alt-right.
JP Sears is not and has never been vegan. He made a couple videos making fun of vegans. His wife was vegan, but he's always promoted a paleo diet. I think it's hilarious that the one example she could find doesn't even prove her point.
Adolf Hitler, whose vegetarianism is well known in popular culture, certainly connected diet with race. In Hitler's Table Talk 1941 to 44, a collection of transcribed monologues delivered by the Fuhrer in conversation with his inner circle, he advocates for vegetarianism as a universally natural and healthy choice, using humans' vegetarian ancestral instincts and young children's antipathy to meat as evidence for his argument.
Hitler was not a vegetarian. Let's just debunk this right here. There are many examples of him eating meat even later in his life, but even if he were vegetarian, how does that disprove veganism? Vegetarians think that animals can be used as resources. We don't. Now, are there alt-right vegans? Sure, there's probably a few. But does their content start with kind of innocent vegan content like recipe videos or fitness and then turn into saying that you should stay at home and make dinner for your husband? I've personally never seen that. I'm not saying that that completely doesn't exist because I don't know, but to me, the alt-right diet is defined by animal products. Every alt-right account showcases eggs, steak, raw milk, beef tallow. The right mocks vegans all the time.
We need to get testosterone rates up, not down, and you do that by eating meat and not eating soybeans.
But let's take a second and imagine a world where Christian nationalists win. Let's say it's the United States and everyone is alt-right. Do you seriously think that everyone in that world would be vegan? Can you imagine Donald Trump promoting plant-based diets? It just wouldn't happen. Dominating other species and other races and other genders is central to the alt-right worldview. Personally, when I went vegan, I was not a leftist at all. However, after learning more about animal exploitation and how it affects marginalized groups and then their struggles in general, it just opened me up to being more progressive in general, and I know that that's not just me. It made me want to do more to fight for animals and to also fight for humans. So while I think Angela completely missed the mark on the vegan to alt-right thing, I do think she's right that there is a lot of racism in the animal rights movement. I've said this before, but a leader of a Black advocacy group told me that the #1 reason Black activists quit is because of racism. That is indefensible, especially for a social justice movement. Now, if a vegan activist wants to only focus on the animals, that is completely fine. If a gay activist wanted to focus on gay rights, we wouldn't tell them that they needed to focus on women's rights, but for some reason, when animal rights are only speaking for animals, people are constantly telling them that they need to focus on human issues, and that's because people prioritize humans so far above animals, which reveals their speciesism. So that being said, my issue with the vegan community is that when vegan activists do talk about other issues, like Palestine or Black liberation or ICE, they are told that they should only focus on the animals. And I think that's messed up. And if a Black activist brings up racism in a way that makes a white activist uncomfortable, and let's face it, white people usually get uncomfortable in discussions about racism, then that Black activist is told to shut up and that they're dividing the community. When they bring up concerns about what leaders in the animal rights movement say that are racist, they're also told to shut up because they're dividing the community. And I think it's ironic because that reaction is actually what's dividing our community. It's making people of color feel unwelcome and then they stop showing up. And that hurts the animals. So that's where I agree with Angela, but man, I wish she took a different approach. Instead of shitting on vegan activists, she could have used her time to uplift Black and brown vegan activists. Yes, we should make the animal rights movement and vegan diets more accessible to marginalized communities. But we shouldn't use the lack of diversity in the vegan movement as a way to deny the scientific evidence that vegan diets are better for the animals, the environment, and our health. Anyway, I figure this video is probably gonna piss some people off, so let me know what you think in the comments. And I usually ask for donations to Pro Animal Future, but today I put some links to BIPOC-led animal rights groups, so you can donate to them if you want to. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.